them, their market, skill sets, and knowledge. We hope you enjoy.
Today I'm joined by Chris. Chris, thanks for coming along. Appreciate spending a bit of time for us.
You're most welcome. I know it's been a long time coming, so I know I've been looking forward to it.
Good. So perhaps for our listeners, as I normally start out, provide a bit of background to sort of where you grew up and your school and early education.
Yeah. So Manx is the hills, as they say. But yeah, born and bred in the Isle of Man, grew up here. And while I've worked all over the world, lived here all my life, the Isle of Man has definitely always been my home. Went to Balcamine High School and was, at a very early age, was fascinated with anything technology. So whether or not it's video games, anything from the geek side of things. And as I progressed in, through college and through, high school, it was, that area was always drawn to me. So while my friends and friends were out kicking a football, I was playing video games. And then from an education point of view, I went to college, did IT, unsurprisingly. I did IT at our local college. And then after college, when all my friends kind of went off to university, I think, as most young people do, you had that sort of decision to make. I stayed here on the island, got a job in Walton's, in fixing and repairing and selling computers, PCs. This was when Walton's was in Douglas in the High Street, and and then from there, it was fantastic to sort of leave college and being able to go and get involved in not only the support side of things, but engaging with people on. And I think I was thinking about this, the sort of questions you might ask, and last night, and I think even then, one of the things that I enjoyed most about that role was the education side of things. And that's something that I've carried on in my career. And back then it was educating people how to get on the internet with their dial-up modems and, how to install Internet Explorer or how to, install the drivers for a CD writer. So I did that and after,
what do you think drew you?
Go on, dude.
I was going to say, what do you think drew you to that particularly? Was it was just an interest, and computers were just an interest, and therefore the rabbit hole you went down?
I attended, we're going to jump back and forth here, but I attended my first esports tournament when I was about 6. So I'm turning 40 this year. So, I was over in Blackpool, typical sort of family holiday, and you do all the tour of the Blackpool Tower, and there was a video game tournament taking place that I remember vividly going to see. It was a Space Invaders tournament. So back then, the internet didn't exist. There was no crazy prize money and esports as it is today. It wasn't even called esports. It was like cyber games or competitive video game championships. But So I was always fascinated with video games, being able to, whether or not it's a Space Invaders game, a role playing game, or a racing game, fighting game. So they've always captivated me and fascinated me, and being able to apply some of that in early job in Walton's, my first sort of serious job, I suppose, selling computers. Back then, there were still people coming in saying, look, we want to buy a PC. And these were these hideous, ugly towers that you used to get back in the day. But I want a better graphics card or more memory to be able to play the latest game faster. So that was, it was a joy. And I learned a lot from that, retail customer facing role as well. And I've got 2 boys and I'd love to see both the boys really go into do a stint in retail and do a stint. I think it's so important being able to, learn to think on your feet. You don't know who's going to come through the door and what sort of questions they're going to ask and how to support them. And I had a fantastic few years working in that role. And then after that, my friends, they come back from university, come back to the island with stories of how amazing off-island life is. And And myself and a friend of mine, Martin, we got our heads together and said, look, let's just save up and go backpacking and leave the island for like 3 months. So I left my role in Waltons and traveled around Europe for 3 months until my money ran out. And, that was an enriching experience. And this was before the euro had kicked in, and each country was wildly different than the next. And it was a safer time. And really, sort of, when you say those sort of things, it makes you really feel old. But 20 years ago, Europe was a lot different, and traveling and backpacking around places was a lot different than it would be now. And again, that played quite an important part, I think, in my career, in where I stepped through, being able to go from one country to the next, being able to form relationships with people from a different language and a different background. It was fascinating and did me in good stead when, later on in my career, I would travel a lot. I worked out in different places around the world solo, and you have that confidence, I think, being able to do that, being able to step into a different country or have a conversation with somebody with a different language. So that I came back from backpacking and with a kind of look, I can either go back into retail, or start a different career path that is going to be take me on a different kind of pathway. And at the time, I wanted to continue that computer and IT side of things. So I worked for a local software company and managed their development team for 8 years. So that was, the software that we developed was corporate service software.
Okay.
So I started off in the payroll division, and then I moved into managing the team that looked after the corporate structuring software, the time and billing software. And to do that, before I took that role, I didn't know the first thing about company formation. I didn't know, from 9Ns to share certificates to, Form 1s, and it was a fantastic opportunity because I had to learn these things. I had to build relationships with the company registry, with the tax office, to be able to, because if you're going to develop software for those sort of things, you've got to understand, the outputs. You've got to understand that the form that it's spitting out is accurate.
And I assume during this, to go two things off the back, I assume during this, because obviously we're going to get onto esports, you still video game, and that's still a passion of yours. I assume at home.
Oh, absolutely. So, the
what was around in that kind of
esports industry,
gaming wise? What was the?
So, that was more your StarCrafts and those. Obviously, you've got your Doom and Quake, and they were being played competitively. There's this misunderstanding that esports has just came out of the blue in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, or when Burger won the Fortnite World Cup. That's when esports suddenly appeared, which in reality esports goes all the way back to the 1970s. So the first competitive video game tournament took place in a university out in the States. It was a game called Space War, and that's the first documented kind of competitive video game being taken place, and the winner won a subscription to Rolling Stones magazine. But video games, being played in that sort of competitive format has been around for a long time. So during that time in my career, it was going on, and while, as I said, my mates were watching the football on the telly, I was looking for downloads of tournaments taking place in South Korea, because it was being played competitively at a totally different level there. The guys playing the games, they were superstars. They were on television. There was formed teams there. And
were you ever any good?
Say again?
Were you ever any good?
With myself, to go pro? I'd love to say yes, but it's like it was like if I played any other sport, the percentage of individuals that are fans of that actually get to be at pro level, whether or not, I know you're from a cycling side or from a football or traditional sports, that kind of top percent there that can make a a serious go to make a living out of it is quite small. So, but it was still didn't matter. I mean, I still play the games. I still play the games with my friends, and you could consume the content and you'd read about it. And at the time, going through when I was in that job, internet cafes were kind of rife. So when I was traveling and afforded opportunities to travel in that role, you'd seek out internet cafes and you'd dive in there to play, opportunities to play tournaments together, and we had internet cafes here on the island as well at that time. Fegan's Lounge, and there was internet cafes there. And then in the evening, Gary and the guys that would run that, I'd come down and help out with tournaments there. And so it's always video games and video games played competitively has been there in the background. And when I left the software development company, I moved into a more financial role. So I'd taken that knowledge of company formation, of tax structuring, of trusts, and sort of had a conversation with myself to say, look, I can either go down this IT route, or move into sort of taking that knowledge and kind of take my career at a separate path. And the thing with working in IT is you've got to live and breathe it and have that sort of passion to keep on top of it. Just the same as in esports, but and it wasn't, starting a family, it was very difficult to continue that if I didn't have the passion for the IT side of things, the software development or the hardware. So stepped away from that and had a fantastic run of working for some really big companies on the island in the corporate space, because I could translate geek, I think is probably I'd love to put it like that on my CV, but I could speak with software teams that maybe were rolling out corporate software into a corporate service provider, but I could also have, be confident to have conversations about, corporate structuring or, banking requirements or regulation or legislation, and being able to sort of sit on both sides of the table and kind of translate
that implementation side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I did that, and a role that I took on afforded me the luxury of being able to, go out and work in some different places, Marbella, Mexico City, up and down the UK, visiting our clients. But when I was there, I'd seek out, what tournament was taking place. Was there a competitive tournament taking place there, and go and started to build up a network of contacts in professional video gaming, and that was when the title sort of started to come around of, this is called esports now. And
maybe this is a moment just to talk about that, because that's, I think, again, for the layman, one of the distinctions that I think is important to understand the difference between, I suppose, when people talk about esports, they maybe just think about people just sat on a sofa playing a video game, and that's not quite the same. So do you want to maybe give the listeners, if you can, draw a line in the sand between the two of them?
You know what? I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer, because the esports industry is constantly evolving. And if you ask people that work in the esports world to define themselves and what they do, it is a challenge. So to some folks, esports is video games played in a competitive environment with individuals watching, just the same as other sports. Whereas, your mate sitting down on the sofa is playing, Grand Theft Auto or FIFA or whatever game that is. That's just, enjoying and playing video games, and they call them casual gamers. So that's, casual gamers versus professional gamers. So your professional gamers are the ones that would be part of a team or an organization. But it is a constant challenge, because the esports industry is moving at such a rapid pace, and it's constantly evolving. If you take an example of, a typical esports organization now is always looking at ways to enhance their revenue generation, to bring in more, not only eyeballs for the sponsors that they're sponsored with, but fans to sell merchandise and shirts, and you've got esports awards taking on chess players, which is the current trend at the moment. You've got esports organizations taking on chess grandmasters. And you wouldn't consider chess a video game. So why is an esports organization getting involved in chess? But it's, there is a lot of synergies between chess and video games. At the moment, with people on lockdown, people are playing chess online. And, with things like the Queen's Gambit coming out, more and more people are wanting to watch chess and watch people play chess. And but then 5 years ago, I never would have considered, going to watch an esports tournament and seeing, an org that I'm following also have chess grandmasters on its roster.
Yeah.
So, the esports industry is constantly evolving. But it's exciting. But it can be a challenge sometimes to keep on top of it.
So that team aspect, that organisation. I think I read something recently again. It's inevitably high level. So it hit the news. I think David Beckham, I think, or someone like that, was talking about having an esports team. So is that when you talk about organisation?
He has Guild Esports.
Oh right, okay. So they create. And how does that work? They create an entity and then recruit people on a contract type basis to then represent them at tournaments?
A mixture of both, really. You'll have some orgs that are solely ran on that contract model. You'll have some orgs that operate as from an employee basis. So if you take David Beckham's foray into esports, I mean, it's a good example, I suppose, to show the model. So Guild will have will be made up of different players playing in different games. So the 3 games that Guild Esports operate in is Rocket League, Fortnite, and FIFA. So they will have a Rocket League team. It's made up of 3 players plus a coach. They will have a couple of Fortnite players, and they'll have a couple of FIFA players. They'll also have content creators. The content creators, as part of that organization, they won't be playing professionally. They will be on social channels such as YouTube or Twitch predominantly, wearing the Guild Esports brand with their sponsors slapped on the front as well. And they will be creating content. They'll be playing any game that is currently, trending or interesting, is going to get those eyeballs and followers. And then behind the scenes, you have performance directors, performance coaches, nutritionalists, marketing directors, just the same as any sporting club does. So they will have different moving parts that go beyond the players themselves.
I was chatting with Chris Smith, I think a while ago on Esports, and he talked about a nutritionist, and that while there's kind of the initial kind of thing you think is a bit bonkers, but the reality is it's a competitive environment, and you need every edge you can get. So it's making sure that they're eating properly, sleeping properly, resting, all super important. You just don't really think about
Absolutely.
it.
Absolutely. And anybody listening who hasn't already watched it yet, I highly recommend. There's a show which came out last weekend on the BBC iPlayer, so you can binge it. It's like a box set, and it was on BBC on Sunday as well on normal television, which follows an esports organization called Excel. So they're based out of Twickenham. I've spent some time at Twickenham Stadium with those guys, and it's a real spotlight on the moving parts of an esports organization, and it follows their journey to compete in the tournament of in their particular league, and but it also interviews like you said, the nutritionalists and the guys behind the scenes, and it's narrated by Cillian Murphy, dude from Peaky Blinders. So yeah, I mean, there's so many other factors that go beyond just the players that you see.
Yeah. And this,
I
was going to say this.
Come on, dude.
I was going to say this kind of, maybe not quite explosion, but the bigger profile it continues to get. What do you think that's just down to? Obviously, it's down to interest, because nothing gains momentum without interest. But do you think? Why, I say maybe why now? Is that just the technology, people being able to play games also remotely into a central server, I guess, things like that? What are do you think the key factors are to the growth?
there's so many different ways to answer that one, dude. It's a really good question, but lockdown played a part in some of it, especially from the betting side of things. I mean, the betting and the gambling side of esports is it's a really interesting one, and I've been torn over the last 5 years of my feelings towards the betting side of things of esports. And my current conclusion at the moment is it's a positive thing to have licensed and regulated betting operators sponsoring esports events, offering odds on esports events, because that's what happens in other sports.
Yeah.
If you look at football, I'm not a football guy, but I'm pretty sure that some of the world's biggest teams are sponsored by betting operators. And the same can be said with esports organizations as well. So having the funds being injected into that particular org to allow that esports organization to attract players, to invest in its structure, to hire performance directors, and being able to sort of bet on esports as well. But obviously, I mean, from a regulated and a licensed point of view, and one of the phrases that I use quite a lot in explaining and having these educational conversations with people about esports is you can bet on the outcome of a football match, but that doesn't make playing football gambling. And you can bet on the outcome of an esports match, but that doesn't make playing esports gambling.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. Obviously, there's risks involved as well, regards protection of minors, making sure that there's regulated esports betting organizations are held accountable. And on the Isle of Man here, we've got the three of the world's biggest esports betting operators are based here on the island. So, and they're attracted from the regulatory point of view because our regulator understands, their industry.
Yeah.
So in answer to your question though, dude, I mean, with the growth, you've got more eyeballs because a number of factors. You've got a younger generation now. I mean, I turned 40 this year, and I'm thinking that there's 17, 18-year-olds that are getting into position of decision making, of getting involved in different projects and championing what their company gets involved in, whether or not it's a bank or a payment provider or a law firm, and they're gamers just like I was and just like I am. And you've got a new generation of people coming up that are passionate about this industry, which are adding value into it, and also wanted to watch it as well. I mean, a lot of my friends and colleagues within the industry, they will tune in to watch an esports tournament over watching a traditional, football tournament or rugby or whatever it may be. And then you've got big sponsors, non-endemic sponsors. So these are the sponsors outside of the industry who are really, over the last 4 or 5 years, have ramped up their involvement. So your BMWs, your MasterCards, your Visas, they're getting involved in the industry more and more, which results in higher production value, more eyeballs, shows on BBC. I mean, that organization I talked about before, Excel, they're sponsored by BT. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors which has resulted in this, what I suppose from the outside in looks like a rapid growth, and it is. The esports industry is growing. It's a number of factors, and different games coming on the market as well always has a spike in interest.
It's just thinking back to the betting question, and it's probably my poor layman brain, but my immediate thing when you think about betting on esport is that there's two people playing a game of FIFA, and it's like, well, I'll just throw the game, tell my mates, and mates can make some money. And it's kind of like, I suppose, certainly in more unregulated space, but there's that same sort of stupid mentality really can't be applied to any sport. Two tennis players throwing a game. Well, we see it, don't we? It's, snooker, etc. So
it is, exactly.
Yeah. It's funny how much the media. Well, you can't bet on that because why can you trust two kids in there playing a game? Well, I say kids, they don't have to be kids, but you know what I mean. It's funny how just the default position is, well, they could throw the game, but the reality is that happens everywhere in sport anyway. Well, not everywhere, but it's a common place.
It does. And it's, bets don't take place on you and me playing a game of FIFA.
No.
They take place on tournaments which are being held in, the Mercedes-Benz Arena with, millions of people watching, with huge sponsors. And when you're going to put those events on, a TO, or which is a tournament operator, that they make sure that, that the players can't cheat, that they look at every single detail. They even do dope testing. So to make sure that the players are not, loaded up on Midland. So just the same way as other professional sports, because if you're playing in a tournament, if you take the international, which is a big tournament for a game called Dota 2, the prize pool for the international a year before, because it was cancelled last year, was $35 million. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to run a tournament and the prize pool is $35 million, there has to be processes in place to ensure that these players aren't going to have an edge and aren't going to be cheating. And that comes down to, the booths that they play in are soundproof, that they can't hear the crowd reaction over what their opponents may or may not be doing strategically. That the coach doesn't have, an audio line in to somebody watching live to say, okay, well, actually, the opponent that you're going up against is hiding behind a tree or a bush, or I'm simplifying that. But so there is, there is. I mean, I'm good friends with some coaches in the Counter-Strike scene, and they put a lot of time and effort and energy in making sure that that the players don't need to cheat. But as with any sport, you're always going to have, unfortunately, bad actors which are going to look to cheat the system. But that's where you get referees. I hosted a tournament in London before lockdown. It was a $500,000 tournament, and I spent a lot of time with the referees there. And the referees that they both happen to be female, but the referees there take their job extremely seriously, to the point where we had the stage set up, and one of them stopped the game to make sure that, because she thought that one of the players was, because there was a reflective surface in the corner off stage, and she needed to sort of pause the game to make sure that player wasn't able to kind of look at the reflective surface to kind of bounce back and see what the opponent teams was doing. So yeah, it does take extremely serious. And then the developers of the games, they do their best to ensure that there isn't any opportunities for malicious software to be installed, or any cheating to happen in the game.
Oh, right. It's interesting because in some of the other podcasts I do, I'm chatting to sports people, talk about psychology of in their sport and their mindset, and I imagine again in this scenario, just when you mentioned about someone hiding behind a bush, it's that same. I suppose I'm sure they probably have psychologists working with them to help them deal with the stress. One, the stresses, but also the tactically. I'm sure it bleeds into tactics and things like that as well.
They have sleep psychologists. There's a friend of mine, he based down in South Africa, and he specializes in sleep analysis for esports players. Wow. And making sure that these guys, then they're eating right, they're sleeping right, because if you're going to perform at a high level and be able to communicate with your team members, and playing in tournaments worth millions and millions of dollars, the team owner, just the same as any other sport or organization, wants to know you're performing at your optimal level.
Yeah, of course.
But the psychology does play a big part of it as well. I mean, I've known players who have performed exceptionally well on scrims. Scrims is sort of practice, and when they've been up on stage and they're 17 years old, they're playing live. They've got millions of people watching them from around the world, 50,000 people in a stadium watching them, and they've just bottled it. They've not been able to handle that sort of level of pressure. So big organizations, and even the smaller tier 2 and tier 3 and lower organizations, they understand the importance of providing these young men and women the opportunity to be able to play the games and play it professionally, but also that their health and well-being is paramount and looked after, and making sure that there's avoiding burnout, that opportunities to give them support to help reduce stress is always there. It's gone from growing up and watching it in the internet cafe, that you would just get a load of high-end PCs, throw a load of gamers at it, make sure they're fed and watered with Monster Munch and cans of Coke, and come out when you're good enough. I don't care if you play for 23 hours a day. It's moved way, way beyond that.
Right.
And if you look at someone like Excel, you look at somebody like Excel, they're based in the bowels of Twickenham Stadium. And one of the clear benefits of that is that they can tap into the support network of the rugby training.
It's amazing.
So there's a lot more substance, I suppose, that goes into esports that maybe people outside of the industry are not, they're not familiar with.
So now you're working with Digital Isle of Man. Perhaps provide listeners some, that opportunity when it came up, I'm sure was very exciting. What now is the goal, and obviously maybe talk a bit as well about the regulated space here, and what Isle of Man PLC and yourself are looking to do.
So the opportunity to be head of esports for Digital Isle of Man and represent the government and the island in this space is, I'll be honest, it was a dream come true. Very, very passionate about the Isle of Man. I'm Manx through and through, but also, that passion is rivaled with, my love for esports. So the opportunity, came up, and I had to apply just the same way as anybody would. But what the island was looking to do was, we've got a great track record, as I'm sure maybe some of your listeners know, in regulating high risk industries. Whether or not it's not just betting and gambling. We've got the work that we've done as a financial center in the life insurance, in shipping. We're very good at regulating these industries, and the esports industry is unregulated. And having spent time, as a fan and as a supporter of the industry, and built up good relationships with players and org owners, I've been able to identify and experience some of the pain points that they've had playing in tournaments in certain countries that, they've not been paid on time or in full. They've played in a tournament and they've been given a big novelty check for a photo shoot, but ultimately it's been a case of, okay, we'll come back in 9 months for that prize money because we've spent it. Because there's no regulation to say that we have to effectively, pay that out on time and in full and be held accountable for that. Other issues as well that I thought that could really benefit from being regulated in a way that helps grow the industry and not put shackles on it, and we've seen that with the betting and the gambling licenses here on the island. So the Isle of Man, the island government sort of said, well, look, this industry is happening whether or not we like it or not. We need somebody that lives and breathes esports and understands that world, but also understands the regulatory side of things and understands and can feel comfortable in having those translation questions and answers with different industries. So threw my hat in the ring and fortunate that that they decided to take me on for the role. And I've spent my time since I landed, which is still fairly fresh. It was August last year. We're working with the regulator on what we can do from a regulatory side, but also a lot of my time is spent from a grassroots side of things. So as anybody who's listening, who's an avid sports fan, forgetting about esports, but as an avid sports fan, they will understand the importance of grassroots and understanding the importance of supporting this new generation coming into that sport and providing the facilities and the services for them to play in a safe environment, have access to, advancement paths and coaches and the equipment. Being able to represent the island is something that I think is, one of the most exciting things for me. In that, seeing young girls, young guys who are, keen to get involved in playing professional esports, and having seen what we've done with cycling, having seen what we've done in snowboarding. We've got no snow here, but we've got a good track record in whether or not it's Zoe, and now you've got Brandon, who's Zoe's protege from the island, and he's part of Team GB snowboarding. And I think it's not a coincidence really that the island is very good at generating Olympic level athletes. We know how to get behind sporting potential. And it's very important for me to be able to focus some of my time on how we can do that and utilize that on the island in an esports capacity. As well as all the other benefits of being able to play in a safe environment with their friends. So part of my role is flying the flag of the island that, look, we're coming into this esports space authentically. I mean, it's a word I use a lot, to the point where it's joked around the office that, it's there's a tally for the amount of times in a day that I use the word authenticity and authentic when I'm on calls about, esports and speaking to people off island. But it resonates so much with those in the esports world. And when I'm talking to esports organizations from a regulatory point of view and say, look, you should come to the island and be involved in these talks from a regulatory side, and sometimes this is difficult for people outside the esports industry to understand the value of this, but they will, hand on heart, every time ask me what we're doing in our grassroots space. I may be an org owner who owns a $25 million esports organization or $100 million esports organization. They will all ask the same question. What have you got going in your back garden to support the future generation? And the reason it's so important for them, and so important for those in the industry, is that they can remember when they were in those internet cafes. They can remember this industry before it was called esports, when they didn't have two pennies to rub together, but they were still, growing this industry, and how important that is to support this new generation coming up. So on the island, I'm excited to be able to help activate some of these things here on the island from a grassroots point of view.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes sense. And if they're committing to the Isle of Man as well, it shows commitment from Isle of Man's perspective, that it's not, I wouldn't say not necessarily all about business. It's all about, like you say, supporting that grassroots element of it, and showing the full buy-in. So in regard to a regulatory position, where do the Isle of Man sit in regard to regulation and in esports?
So we've already got a very robust regulation when it comes to esports betting, which, as I said, you've got Rivalry, Lookbox, Unicorn, other betting operators here that purely focus on esports, and they come here, and their license is seen as a gold standard in the betting world and in the esports world as well. So with regards to regulating the other aspects of esports, we're in the stages of conversations with the key stakeholders. I've been very fortunate, coming back around to when we started this conversation, very fortunate to now tap into my friends and connections within the esports industry who've gone on to run tournament operators or developers of these games, to invite them to the table to say, look, if we're going to craft this regulation, if we're going to go to market with an esports regulation outside of the betting side of things, we want to make sure it's done authentically. We want to make sure it's fit for purpose, it's going to support the industry. So with regards to answer to your question, where we are, we're in advanced stages of conversations with a lot of these key stakeholders to be able to share their pain points with myself and the regulator here on the island. And as we gather that information, we're able to craft a regulation which is not only fit for purpose, but it will be robust, and it will be recognized in the esports industry as, that same gold standard that we've got with our shipping and our betting licenses. And they're exciting conversations to have, because when you have those conversations with these key stakeholders and get them to come to the table, they also want to know about the Isle of Man as well and the other offerings, and whether or not that's corporate structuring or it's coming and setting up a business here on the island and being supported from whether or not it's a startup space or it's a back office space, because there's so many other moving parts that esports organizations are crying out for. it's been interesting to see over the last 5-6 years this shift in approach from those in the esports industry, from keeping it to themselves and being, look, we've built this industry, we don't need support, it's our industry, to actually, if we're going to continue to grow, we need support from lawyers, from banks. We need to have good conversations with these, because we need to be able to have methods to be able to pay our players as swiftly as possible. Because if you imagine you've got an esports organization which has players scattered all over around the world, playing in different tournaments, they have visa requirements, moving from one country to the next. And we've got, on the island, we've got a really good track record in managing those back office things, whether it's shipping industry, you've got crew going from one country to the next. That crew needs to be paid. That crew will have equipment that is bringing in. And that's the same word for a traveling esports, that kind of traveling circus sort of model. And then, so there's a lot of synergies that the island has, and it's great to have these sort of opportunities to be on your podcast, but also to talk to other local businesses. When I talk to them about the esports industry, beyond that kid they saw on television playing Fortnite and winning all that money, you go beyond that and they think, well, actually, we already have services or have products that we're already doing for the shipping industry or the betting industry or other industries, that with a little bit of support and knowledge, we can help that pain point within the esports industry. And that light bulb moment going off is great.
Yeah. And it must be good as well to talk about the stakeholders, for them to be able to sit with a regulator and say, and talk about really, and help mold what they're looking for. That must be, you must get positive feedback from that, rather than kind of like a regulation just coming in and dumping a load of regulations and go and crack on.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head, dude, because just some of the positive conversations I've had with these guys has been, they've never actually been able to have a conversation with a regulator before. Some of them didn't even know exactly what a regulator did. I mean,
getting away.
So yeah, exactly. So being able to have that conversation with these guys and to facilitate that conversation has been, really rewarding and been really positive. And then, the spin-off of that is they see the Isle of Man as a forward-thinking jurisdiction that is coming at this with authenticity. I think we want a tally of 3. I've said that now, but it comes at the industry. It comes at the industry with the right approach that they see, and that gives them comfort that if they want to do business here on the island, it's a welcoming environment. Yeah. Not just trying to wring them out for as much cash as they can get because it's the hottest thing at the moment. Esports is booming, is one of the most used phrases I've seen in articles over the last 12 months. Esports is booming. But from those in the industry and those that work in the industry, it's sometimes a bit of a trigger to see that in the esports industry has been around for a while.
And people like ourselves, on where I work, you're perhaps one of those peripheral firms that have the ability to maybe interact with the industry for service providers. For people out there that perhaps might be lawyers as well, things like that want to maybe just start with a kind of, outside of this podcast, obviously Esports 101, and start to go down a rabbit hole learning more. What's kind of tips or areas or places to point people? Is that to go to YouTube, sign up to, subscribe to magazines, etc., online newsletters to learn more? Phone you?
Yeah. So, yeah. I'd say a few recommendations on that one. So they could go to, there's a few websites from a B2B, a business side of things that look after esports. So you've got Esports Insider, esportsinsider.com. You've got Dexerto, which is DEXERTO. And there's sections there that focus on the business side of things. And they cover things like partnership activations. And they've got all sorts of articles, which is written, if you're not in the esports and you're learning, but you're a lawyer used that as an example, you can understand the opportunities by reading those articles for you and your firm, rather than just diving into a YouTube or a Twitch channel and just being overwhelmed. I'd recommend I find that there are still people that are afraid of catching geek. It's probably not the right terminology to use as we're going through a pandemic, but they're interested in learning, but they're afraid if they put their hand up and say, well, actually, I do play. I still play Tomb Raider, or I still play, Pac-Man, but I don't want to admit that. I don't want to admit it to my colleagues or my friends that I do that. But not being afraid to do that, because the world is very different now. That if you admit you're playing video games and you enjoy video games, you're not going to get, labeled or ridiculed as maybe you did sort of 20, 25 years ago. And there's so many opportunities when you step into the space, and whatever game you're into, there'll be, a fan base there, and there's a game for everybody as well. And you could learn so much more by playing the game, and then also it gives you a pathway then to start watching that game being played on Twitch. And Twitch is the main platform for streaming games, not just video games, but mainly video games. And that will give you sort of a comfort zone, because if you're watching people play a game that you like on this platform, rather than just going in totally cold. So, and then there's certain personalities, to follow if you use social media and you use Twitch as an example. There's a friend of mine, Adam Fitch. He's a journalist for esports, and he's somebody that you would be able to follow and see, and he spotlights on different industry and the B2B side of things within esports. But then, and also not being afraid to ask, like to kind of summarize the last point that you said, they're not being afraid to ask and pick up the phone to myself. So if you are, if you're Isle of Man, especially pick up the phone, but even, outside of the island. And what, you'll find is most people in the esports industry are very open and welcoming of people wanting to learn about their space. Yeah. So connecting with them on LinkedIn is there's a lot of people on LinkedIn in the esports space from the business side, because there is, again, they want to learn from lawyers, from corporate service providers, from nutritionalists, from traditional sports. So it's not being afraid to kind of reach out and ask. And if you're seen as bringing value into esports, you'll be very welcomed. Yeah. If you bring value, put value in before you take value out, then you'll be welcomed with open arms.
Yeah, right. Okay. And just to maybe a couple of final questions before we wrap up. What's your favorite game at the moment?
Oh, good question, man. I'm actually, I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with Fortnite. And while, so Fortnite is a fantastic game for me to play with my youngest. As with most people that work in, say again?
Because you can smash him.
No, it's the total opposite. In fact, I mean, he there's a term used in esports called carry, and he carries me. Oh, right. And I'm in talks with a number of coaches, calling in favors to say, look, my son's got massive potential. He's a fantastic player. I'd love to help you coach him. So I enjoy that because it's an opportunity for me to play with him. And as most people that work in different industries, I play less games than I ever have now. Now I work in this role. People sometimes say, oh, you get to play games. I'm far from it. A lot of my time is writing reports, is putting presentations together. So I play less games than I ever have. From an esports title, it's probably Hearthstone. So Hearthstone is it's a card game, a collectible card game. It's a digital card game, and it's something that I played a lot when I was traveling, because I can play it on my tablet, I can play it on my phone, and when I'm stuck in an airport and waiting for the fog to clear to come home, I can play some rounds of Hearthstone, and so I play that a fair bit. But there's so many games coming on. I mean, games to watch. I'm a massive Counter-Strike fan, and I enjoy. I've got an org that I follow, just the same way as people will have. They might be fans of Manchester United or Liverpool, Everton. So the org that I follow is a Swedish org, and I've followed them for a number of years, and I'm very passionate about that particular organization. And they recently sold their roster, and they've taken on It's like the worst kept secret in esports at the moment. Today, around 6, they're going to announce their new Brazilian roster. They've picked up some 5 Brazilian players that's some of the best in the world. So there's a lot going on in that space, and I can get very passionate when watching those guys play. So yeah, in answer to your question, there's a few games I play. What about yourself?
No, I must say I'm not a gamer. I just haven't got the patience. I used to play Commando on the Commodore 64. That's about as far as my. Okay. It was when my parents came home at probably the age of me. My sister said probably at the age of 8. Said to my parents, they said, "We're going to get you a computer for Christmas." We said, "Don't get us a VIC-20 because they're rubbish. Get us a Commodore 64." And of course, they came home with a VIC-20. So yeah, I'm not really a gamer per se. I just haven't got the patience for it. Struggle to have the patience. So solitaire.
Would you ever look to? Yes. Would you ever look to get involved in some of the cycling side of things?
Yeah. Well, so funny you should say that actually, because with Zwift. So a good friend that I co-host another podcast with, he's on a team. He rides, him, Matt. He rides for them. I've used it, but never to race. And funny enough, I did my first formal race at the weekend. I say race. I met a load of mates online, but we raced. It's the first time I properly raced on. In fact, no, that's a lie, because I did race the next day. And I could see, in fairness, I did actually enjoy it, apart from the pain of an hour on the limit. But and you can see that more. I suppose that's obviously going to happen more and more. You see Zwift, the cycling one, getting more and more professional. People pay to do it now. So often when I think of esports, that's normally, in fairness, if somebody said esport, I'd think of Zwift. There's obviously, like you say, from chess to video games to, I'm sure it'll be people running on treadmills. Well, I'm sure that's going on already. Things like that.
Oh, so Zwift has a treadmill module, doesn't it? You can go on the treadmill on Zwift as well, and
I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And the biggest trends at the moment, I mean, you've got mobile esports, so people playing esports titles on their mobile, and which is usually that sort of reaction you've just had there with regards to when I say, the biggest trend is going to be mobile esports, but the reason being is that it's the barrier of entry. So you've got a smaller barrier of entry. So if you wanted to play some professional sports, like I mentioned Counter-Strike, you'd need to have an investment in a gaming rig and a professional gaming keyboard and gaming mouse. And whereas with some other titles like PUBG Mobile is probably the leading one, you just need a phone. And it's been really popular in emerging countries, so especially down in India, in Africa, because you can, people down there, the young gamers, they can't afford a PlayStation 5, they can't afford a big gaming rig, but they've got iPhones and being able to sort of still compete. And the PUBG Corporation, they put a lot into that grassroots space. Okay. They put a lot of money into supporting that ecosystem of those young men and women who want to play professional esports, and they want to play on that platform and have a pathway to playing in big tournaments and getting, winning big prize money, but also being able to play with other people around the world. Mobile esports is definitely the big trend for this year.
And I just thought connectivity would be the issue because I presume you can't hardwire in a cable, so therefore you're somewhat reliant on, I don't know, I always think with gaming, because you've got a hard line into your computer, the drops are very rare, whereby the internet, and if you're with some local providers on the Isle of Man, they're not the greatest, so let alone India or Africa. We're making improvements. This is where I throw my government hat firmly on and support my colleagues in the infrastructure side of things. I don't blame you. Well, yeah, maybe you do. I don't know. No, but I think in Africa, or I think in places like that to play. But I guess again, maybe it's more the grassroots and more probably, like you say, friends playing Sage, and it's growing and it's on this path similar that we've seen in esports in general, and it's just in an earlier grassroots phase. Yeah. So
I'd say so. But don't forget, I mean, in some of those countries, they use their mobiles for everything. They use it in placement of their banks. Yeah. So connectivity is surprisingly advanced in some places that you may not think, because that's what they use for making payments, getting paid. Shopping is all done on their mobile phone. And you've got likes of Facebook sending out these balloons for internet connectivity and making sure that everybody is connected. So from an esports, but it also means, outside of countries like that, it's very easy to engage. So like the game I talked about, Hearthstone, I can play it on a PC, I can play it on my laptop, but it's great for me to be able to play competitively on my phone in an airport or on the sofa, and still enjoy, playing competitively in that environment. So lots of moving parts and lots of opportunities in that space.
Well, thanks for joining us today. Just to finish off, if people, or the best way to reach out to yourself and to get more information, I suppose, from the Isle of Man angle as well.
I'd say, you can go onto the Digital Isle of Man's website. I need to push that first and foremost. And we've got a dedicated page on there from an esports point of view. The other side is LinkedIn. That's my home from away from home in the digital space. So I'm very active on LinkedIn, sharing articles on esports, sharing my thoughts, and engaging in conversation. So if somebody does, they're off island, obviously if they're on island, they can pick up the phone and or even rock up to the digital agency and come and have a chat with me. But if it's off island, absolutely look me up on LinkedIn, and send me a request, and I'm more than happy to engage and answer any questions that they've got about the industry.
Super. Thanks for joining me today. Really interesting.
It's cool.
An opportunity of what's going on the Isle of Man, and obviously for yourself, and doing a job you're very passionate about as well. So I appreciate your time today.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate having me on, and you've had some great guests on this show. So I'm really grateful for you to ask me on. So thank you very much.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. Thanks for listening, everyone.